Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And we traditionally have just one session with Dr. Haas during the Yom Kippur break, but we were all shell-shocked by the news on Erev Rosh Hashanah of the passing, the very sad passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory. We We're frozen. We stumbled through our words on Rosh Hashanah, the first day, and then Rabbi Zuckerman shared some beautiful thoughts earlier today about the Supreme Court Justice's passing, and we were honored in our own community to use her recitation of the prayer for the country when we said the prayer for the country, a loss for the Supreme Court, a loss first and foremost for her family and for her loved ones, and a loss for our country, felt acutely so by the Jewish community as a Jewish Supreme Court justice. And so we very quickly thought, what could we do as a synagogue to pay tribute, to mourn, and to reflect on the legacy of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we were able to contact two people who knew her personally, who can speak to her intellectual and legacy and the journey of her life, and to be in dialogue with each other. And that there would be no better tribute than to spend an hour on this Yom Kippur to engage in dialogue on this great, great woman. Our conversation partners are, I'll just go alphabetically, Abbe Gluck, a professor of law and founding director of the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School. Abbe is also the professor of internal medicine at Yale School of Medicine. She joined Yale Law School in 2012, having previously served on the faculty of Columbia Law. She's an expert on Congress, civil procedure, federalism, and health law. Abbe has extensive experience working as a lawyer in all levels of government, having served in the administrations of John Corzine, Michael Bloomberg, and in the Senate for Senate Paul Sarbanes of Maryland. Having earned her Yale Law School degree, she clerked after law school with U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She has many publications in the Yale Law Journal, the Harvard Law Review, the Stanford, Columbia, a lot of publications. And her most recent book is The $1 Trillion Revolution, How the Affordable Care Act Transformed Politics, Law, and Healthcare in America, with Zeke Emanuel, published in March. She sits on numerous commissions. I'm not going to read them all. I'm only going to say that Abbe Gluck is a proud, lifelong member of Park Avenue Synagogue, and her boys will be reading Torah during the Mincha service. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate the public about the U.S. Constitution, serving as an interactive museum, national town hall, and provider of nonpartisan resources for civic education. It's totally amazing. If you've never been on the website, I recommend it to everybody, and please God, when it opens, to go. Rosen became president and CEO in 2013 and has developed the center's acclaimed interactive constitution, which brings together top conservative and liberal legal scholars in America to discuss areas of agreement and disagreement about every clause of the Constitution. Jeffrey is also professor of law at GW Law School and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, New Republic, where he was a legal affairs editor, and the New Yorker, where he was a staff writer. He's written 6 books, but I want to focus most recently on his book, Conversations with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, on life, love, liberty, and law, and a graduate of Harvard, Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. Welcome, Jeffrey. Welcome, Abbe. And let me just begin by expressing my deepest personal condolences to you. Oh, I forgot to say, I'm sorry. And Jeffrey, though he lives in D.C., when he's in New York, where he's from, we have him here at Park Avenue Synagogue. So my deepest condolences to you both. May your mentor's memory be for a blessing. Abbe, Jeff, can we just begin on a personal note? I know you were both in D.C. Over these last few days. Can you tell us what you experienced and what you saw and what you felt? And those of us on the Zoom call, a sense of what the mourning process was like. Why don't we just begin with you, Abbe, and then you, Jeff?
Thank you, Rabbi. Let me thank you for inviting me and having this event. And it's such a pleasure to talk with Jeff about the justice. It's not the first time we've shared these conversations, and it's always such a privilege. And I want to wish all of my wonderful fellow congregants a Shana Tova. So thank you for joining us. If I may, I would love to talk about the mourning. It was a momentous and really difficult week. Also very beautiful and both very American and very Jewish at the same time. Justice Ginsburg had this line that she often used when she spoke to Jewish groups. I'm just going to give you a piece of it. She would always say, "I'm an American, a judge, born, raised, and proud of being a Jew." And I thought about that line so many times, starting from the time we got to the court. So for those of you who might not have seen it on television, there's a tradition that the law clerks who clerked for Justice Ginsburg, I worked for her in the 2003 term, receive the casket at the court as an honor. Justice Ginsburg had 121 out of 169 of her law clerks, dropped everything during a pandemic, many flying across the country, to stand on the plaza of the Supreme Court to wait for her. And there were so many of us that a lot of the news stories compared it to an army waiting for her. She arrived and her casket was brought into the Great Hall of the court, where a female rabbi, and of course there was going to be a woman rabbi from a conservative synagogue in Washington, D.C., gave a beautiful service where she sang the memorial prayer, Amalek Rachamim, incredibly loudly and incredibly beautifully. It rang through the court and onto the plaza. You could hear it that loudly. She also said, Lador Vador, justice from generation to generation. Let us carry your teachings with you. The ceremony had a lot of traditions that are typical for the Supreme Court, but actually were very Jewish to my mind. The justice's chair and the courtroom were draped as a sign of mourning. The mirrors were not draped, but her chair was draped. And then after the ceremony, there's a tradition that the law clerks stand by the casket until the casket leaves the court building. But it's never been done to my knowledge for this long or by this many. So the 121 law clerks took shifts through the night, 2 in the morning, 1 in the morning, 6 in the morning, for 48 hours, standing by her side until the casket left the building. And I kept thinking over and over that this reminded me so much of the Jewish tradition of standing by the casket until it's laid to rest. It was incredibly moving and a wonderful way to send her off, and incredibly difficult.
Thank you. Jeff, what did you experience?
I want to thank you too, Rabbi, for the incredible honor of commemorating Justice Ginsburg in this community. It's so meaningful for me to be part of the community and to participate in this incredibly moving service, and to commemorate Justice Ginsburg with Abbe now means more than I can say. So Abbe described so well the ceremony, and those friends who saw it on TV will agree with her about how strikingly Jewish it was. And Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt from the Addis Israel Synagogue, where Justice Ginsburg worshipped, emphasized that the Hebrew Bible refers 12 times to widows, orphans, and strangers, and connected that to Justice Ginsburg's vision of a more embracive constitution that comes to embrace not only the strong, but also the left out people, not grudgingly, but with open arms. It was so powerful when she quoted that scripture that was in Justice Ginsburg's chambers, in all things justice, justice, let's pursue, and also ended with the blessing, blessed be the true judge, the divine. So my wife Lauren and I went to pay our respects at the court on Thursday and stood in front of the casket, which was flanked, as Abbe said, by 2 law clerks and by an honor guard. And friends, I have to say and share that the image of the justice resting in state on the steps of the court was so overwhelmingly moving that we knelt down in reverence and sadness and prayer. And what struck me first is how far she came. Justice Ginsburg often emphasized her mother was a bookkeeper who, fleeing oppression in Eastern Europe, loved books and music so much that she enjoined young Ruth always to be independent, be a lady, and to master unproductive emotions like anger, remorse, and jealousy, the ones, Rabbi, that you talked about in your sermon last night. And when asked what the difference between a bookkeeper and a Supreme Court justice was, Justice Ginsburg would reply, 1 generation. And thinking about the fact that she came from Brooklyn in 1933, where she was born, and in 1 generation, not only rose to serve on the Supreme Court, not only rose to be the most important advocate for gender equality of our time, not only rose to be one of the most influential figures for constitutional change in American history, but in addition to all that, became the first woman ever to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol and the first Jewish American ever to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. And just looking at her flag-draped coffin and thinking of how far she came in 1 generation was incredibly powerful. And then just think of the indelible mark that she inscribed on our history. And she did it by sheer force of will, vision, courage, and fervent, overwhelming, ceaseless focus and hard work. She always stressed, and she emphasized this repeatedly, that she was not alone in her achievements, and that she was joined by many courageous women and men in the fight for gender equality. But what I want to share with our friends, and I'll do it later in the conversation with some specific examples, is the fact of just how hard she worked, using every moment of the day so that she could focus her formidable energies on productive work of serving others and, as she put it, of using whatever talent I have to the very best of my ability to repair the tears in our society and make the world a little better. That was her phrase, and it was just extraordinary how much she achieved in 87 years on Earth, and all of that washed over me with overwhelming force as I knelt with reverence before her casket.
Jeff, thank you. I'm deeply aware, just hearing both of you speak, it's a national loss for everyone watching, but it's a deeply personal loss for each of you. And I am acutely aware and attuned to the pain of this conversation. Can I ask Abbe, if we continue with the personal, just for one more round of a question? I don't know what it's like to clerk with someone. I mean, how did you build a relationship? What's the relationship after one clerks? And Jeff has already talked about sort of some influences and lessons. Can you begin to give words to that? So I guess there's both a practical element of how your relationship, but also to begin to reflect on her impact on you.
Oh, thanks. Every justice on the Supreme Court generally has 4 law clerks. and it's a very, very close relationship. You're with the justice for an entire year, whether it's going to the opera or talking about opinions and cases and writing opinions. The first time I met Justice Ginsburg, we talked for about 2 hours about the law, and then she took me around her office and showed me pictures of herself and Justice Scalia traveling all over the world. I am very tall, and Justice Ginsburg is not, and I was standing next to her, looking at her tchotchkes, very much aware of how I was towering over this extraordinary figure, and found myself gently lowering my knees so I could be at her level. And I held a squat for about an hour and was very, very sore the next day. But it was well worth it. I actually was reading Katharine Graham's autobiography the day of my interview on the train down to DC, and every minute of our conversation was so extraordinary. I thought I would never have the chance to be in that kind of greatness again. And on the way home, I wrote in the back of that book every word of the conversation so that I would always remember it. And never my wildest dreams did I think that I would have more than 20 years of conversations with her and mentorship from her. So Justice Ginsburg, as Jeff said, is the hardest working person anyone will ever encounter. She's careful, she's deliberate. She taught us to be careful and deliberate and so to be confident in our work. I was on a phone call last week with a very well-known conservative Supreme Court advocate who said the lawyer's benefit in arguing before the Supreme Court is that he or she generally knows his own case better than the justices. And then he said, with the sole exception of Justice Ginsburg. So it was daunting to clerk for her because she demanded so much of us, but she gave so much back to us. So for years after, she was a mentor. She was warm and affectionate. Many of you know my own daughter's name is Ruth, not for Justice Ginsburg, but for my mother. But Justice Ginsburg always put stuff aside that said Ruth on it. She got reams and reams of things, put them in bags, and whenever I came by the court, she had a little goodie bag from one Ruth to another Ruth. She was always thinking of her law clerks. There's so many things to say about her and what she taught us, but I'll just say 2 more so we can have time to hear from Jeff and keep talking. But she lived an extraordinarily full life. So she would work all day and then at 8 o'clock go to an opera, one of her loves, and come back at 11 p.m. and then work till 3 a.m. She sent faxes at all hours of the night. She filled every minute of her life with the things she loved, whether it was her passion for the arts or the court. And then, of course, there was her marriage, which was a marriage for the ages, sort of the model of an equal partnership between the sexes that she hoped the law would realize, that she and her husband lived and modeled for her law clerks every day as a hope for the future and something we all could aspire to. And truly not a day goes by in my life that I don't think about the work ethic, the collegiality, the deliberateness, the optimism that she had in the court and the country and the Constitution to always rise above. And it's just, the loss is just immeasurable.
Thank you, Abbe, for sharing a view. Jeff, you wrote a book on the justice. Can tell us about your relationship with her?
I met Justice Ginsburg in an elevator in 1991. I was a law clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. She was a judge who I'd not met before because I was clerking for Abner Mikva. And she was coming down from an exercise class. Even then, she was a formidable exerciser. And in the elevator, she maintained that sphinx-like silence that those who don't know her can mistake for remoteness. Very intimidating to go on an elevator in silence with this extremely intimidating woman. So I just blurted out the first question I could think of, which was, what operas have you seen recently? And I don't think I knew that, in fact, that she was an opera fan, but I am. And of course, it was exactly the right question to ask because she loves opera. And that just began a conversation about music that began that year when I was a law clerk and continued over the next 30 years. Abbe, and Justice Ginsburg would have loved, I know, Cantor Schwartz and Cantor Brook and that great cantorial tradition. I loved playing Moshe Kusevitsky yesterday. she told me many times how much she loved hearing Richard Tucker at the Met, in part because of his cantoral roots. And I was thinking of her throughout the beautiful music yesterday. Abbe captured so well her astonishing work ethic. And what I want to share, I want to give an example of that and then tell what I took from it, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of this great woman on a day-to-day basis in terms of how to live. So here's my story. 2 years ago, I asked her if I could collect our interviews over the years into the book that became Conversations with RBG. And she agreed, and she invited my wife Lauren and me to spend a weekend with her at Glimmerglass, and we heard West Side Story and modern opera, and we met Margaret Atwood, and we talked opera with her daughter-in-law Patrice and Jim, and Nirvana. You can imagine that this was complete heaven to have this extraordinary experience. And then I collected the interviews, and she got sick. This was 2 years ago, and was recovering from cancer, and I didn't know if she'd have time to turn to the manuscript. 2 years ago, 10 minutes after the Supreme Court term ended, I got an email from her saying, your manuscript is ready and I'll have it for you on Tuesday. And I went to the court to get it. And there she handed me every page of the manuscript marked up in her beautiful pencil, typos, commas, individual adjectives, adverbs taken out for being too wordy, editing her own words to make them more precise and perfect on each page. And I was stunned. I said, how on earth did you have time to do this? You were recovering from illness. You were working on the Supreme Court. You have all of these burdens. And she said, well, I told you I would get it, and I like to meet my deadlines. And I said, well, I understand, but how is it actually possible physically, given all that you had? And she said, well, I'd edit it in the back of cars, or sometimes, at the opera before the show started, but I really wanted to make sure that I had it for you. And just the image of this great woman with all the burdens who able to turn her totally focused attention to every word that went out under her name. And it wasn't just my manuscript, it was every email that she sent and every letter in response to good wishes from around the country. There was nothing that didn't get her total focus. I was very eager to understand how she actually did it. So in our final interview, which was last December 2019, after a beautiful performance of her daughter-in-law Patrice's song cycle, Notorious RBG, I said, what's the source of your astonishing focus and self-discipline? And she gave that advice about how her mother had advised her to overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and remorse. And I said, Rabbi, kind of in the spirit of what you were saying last night, yes, well, that's the advice of the great wisdom traditions of the Hebrew Bible, of our faith. But it's very hard to achieve in practice. Yes, it is, she said. Well, how do you actually do it? And she said, I realize if I don't do it, I will lose time for productive work and for helping others. And I asked her, where did this though come from in your background? And this empathy, this always thinking not just of yourself, but working for others. And she thought, and she said, one of the most intimate things that she'd ever shared in our interviews, she said, perhaps it comes when I suffered loss as a child. First, my sister died when I was very young. She was less than 2 years old, and her sister was 6. And Justice Ginsburg said, seeing the effect of that loss, the grief that it caused her parents, made her realize that if she can make others feel better, she would try to do that. And that gave her a sense of compassion. And then her mother got sick right before she graduated from high school, from James Madison High School, and died the day before her graduation. And Justice Ginsburg said, she remembered sitting on her mother's bed when her mother was ill, trying not to disturb her, but always trying to focus completely on her work so she could live up to her mother's expectations. And when she needed to get a release, playing the piano or the cello that would take her out of herself and her own concerns so that she could focus on her work and help others. She thought perhaps that was the source of some of that focus. It's the most astonishing thing I've ever seen. Abbe noticed it too. She worked harder than anyone else. So just what I want to share is, whenever, this has been a very sad period for all of us, but whenever I find myself either wallowing in sadness or grief, I think of the fact that she went back to the Supreme Court bench 3 days after Marty died. Her beloved Marty died, She went back to the bench because she said that's what he would have wanted. And when she saw me at that 2019 interview, she just recovered from cancer herself, but she handed me a note because my mom had just passed away a week before. And she said, even when one is all grown up, the loss of a beloved parent is difficult to bear. Carry on in your life and work. Isn't that just what she would have wanted? So I think about her over the past weeks, and just sharing these stories with you and talking with Abbe is what she would have wanted. Always carry on, always emphasizing productive work. And whenever I find myself wasting time or surfing the web or, being distracted, I think, what would RBG do? And that's get back to work so we can try to use whatever talents we have to serve others and make the world a little bit better.
Which, of course, as a rabbi, I think is exactly the message of Yom Kippur, of we all have a limited and uncertain amount of time, so how we use our time is of utmost concern.
Can I just
Of course.
follow up on that? Because exactly something I wanted to say. So I don't know if this is a coincidence, but in your Yisker sermon today, you used that phrase from Deuteronomy, choose life.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a coincidence, but Justice Ginsburg used that phrase in speeches, a lot of speeches, including one that I worked on with her for the 2004 United States National Holocaust Remembrance Day. And her point was, how to make sense of the grief of the Holocaust, how to move on. And her response was to look to Deuteronomy and first to say, tzedek, tzedek, tirda, justice, justice, that you should pursue, which as Jeff said was on her walls and sewn into one of her collars on her robes. But also that phrase, choose life, in Deuteronomy, in the sense that we soldier on, we stay strong, and we look forward with an optimism to help others and make the world a more just place. So in hearing you say that today, it was just so incredibly meaningful. I'll also say to Jeff that she was a relentless editor, and I will never start a phrase with the word however, ever. I still have not since 2003. And there are many other words that I just will not use ever because Justice Ginsburg told me that I could not use them.
I'll just quickly share one. That's amazing about Choose Life. What an inspiring blessing by the justice and of the aptness of Rabbi Cosgrove's emphasis on that duty that we all have. But the only time she ever got impatient with me was a few months ago when I basically sent her the transcript of the final interview, the one that I just described in December, and the publisher announced that they wanted it for the paperback, and they gave a really tight deadline of Friday. So I wrote to her on Monday and said, you may not have time for this, but if you could, the publisher would like it by Friday. She fired back an email. I am not sure I can get to it by Friday. You do not have my permission to publish until I've read it. I forbid publication until I've reviewed this. I will get back to you. And I was mortified and embarrassed to have given her such a ridiculous deadline. I also noted that this was the day that she had just filed a very fiery dissent from the Wisconsin case where she objected to the artificial deadline that she felt the Supreme Court had imposed for ballots from Wisconsin to be counted. So it was not a good time to be giving her silly deadlines. In any event, Friday evening at 7:30 p.m., the email arrives. The justice has sent the fully copy-edited manuscript, each word reviewed and each comma perfected. And she said, I'm, delighted to share this, and you have my blessing, and so glad we could do this interview together. I think for her, and even at the, even in her last year, she was still beating all the other justices in their assignments. She turned in her opinions more quickly than any other justice this term, even this term. And that is how focused she was to choosing life, always to moving ahead. And of course, she was, until the end, productive and focused and moving forward.
One of her most
I want to just, Abbe, if I may, I want to pivot from the personal into her legacy. And we're both of you have made mention of her notions and decisions and legacy regarding gender equality. So for those of us, me, who don't actually know how to speak intelligently about this, who never did more than take the LSAT once, help me understand, because there are different notions of gender equality out there. I think, Jeff, in your book, you have an image of, I believe, of her late husband holding one of the children, this idea of men and women playing an equal role both in society and in family structures and otherwise, which is one of. So I don't know who we can go. Let's just keep going and around like this. Abbe, can you speak to her judicial legacy and philosophy when it comes to matters of gender equality, and maybe how it's the same or different and transformative?
Sure. So the first thing I just want to say for people who may not realize it is that it was not until 1971 that the Supreme Court of the United States recognized sex discrimination as a cause of action under the Equal Protection Clause. 1971, let's say that again, 50 years ago, that the Supreme Court of the United States recognized this. That was Justice Ginsburg's case, right? Reed versus Reed. So first thing I just want to say is that our modern notion, indeed our entire notion of constitutional gender equality, comes from the series of cases that Justice Ginsburg litigated in the 1970s and then implemented across all aspects of American law throughout her time on the bench. And for all the notorious RBG, for all the amazing things about her that we know of recently, I just want people to take away from this, that they know where that right came from and who innovated it. And at that time, there was a choice. Many people thought, let's give women different treatment, right? Same but different. And Justice Ginsburg will call that pedestal treatment. She didn't want women to have pedestal treatment. Her phrase was equal and full citizenship stature. For her, men and women were the same. And it's no coincidence that the cases that Justice Ginsburg brought in the 1970s, most of her plaintiffs were men. And they were men who were contravening traditional gender stereotype roles. There were men who wanted to stay home with their kids and wanted the same benefit that their wife would get under the circumstances. She brought these cases one by one to develop a notion of equality where men and women, again, would get equal and full citizenship stature. Today, we take that for granted, but it was not. It was revolutionary. It earned her some enemies back then, right? But it transformed the way we see the sexes today. And many believe, laid the foundation for the Supreme Court's opinion last term, recognizing sexual orientation discrimination under the Civil Rights Act also. So it's a long trajectory. It's truly revolutionary. And her strategy was always to think of roles in which men and women might have been contravening stereotype and bring those cases. So one of the case, the picture, I'll just mention that picture. I mean, there's a case that she loved, which was Weisenfeld versus Weisenberger, which I think Jeff's going to talk about. But it's this case in which there was a husband who wanted to stay home and take care of his children after his wife had died. And Justice Ginsburg litigated that case for him. And I think it reflected for her the kind of society that she hoped we would all achieve. Society in which it was always normal, always unconventional, and always conventional for a man to stay home with the children as much as the woman. And she achieved that. And she also achieved that in her marriage too. She modeled it in her everyday life.
Jeff, can you help build on that?
I can build on it, but I can't improve on it because Abbe just wonderfully distilled the essence of Justice Ginsburg's contribution to transforming gender-based jurisprudence in a way that made the dean of Harvard Law School call her the Thurgood Marshall of the women's movement because of her magnitude of her vision. The story about the picture I got in a funny way. The New York Times in 1997 asked me to write a piece about her, but she didn't want to be interviewed. She felt it was too early. And I said, I need a scene for the piece just to set it up. And she had a very unusual solution. She invited me to come to her chambers to look around for as long as I wanted And then she just disappeared. So I'm sitting alone in her chambers at her invitation, kind of looking at the pictures of Justice Scalia and her on the elephant and seeing what books are on her wall. And then suddenly the justice calls from the car and she calls my attention to that picture. And it was of her son-in-law holding her infant grandson, Paul. And she said, "That's my hope for the future." And I thought at the time it was a sort of platitude about, grandchildren being the hope for the future. But then I read her speeches and saw that, in fact, she was saying, as Abbe said, and as you said, Rabbi, that only when men and women take equal responsibility for childcare, she felt, would men and women be truly equal. And that was why she loved the Weisenfeld case that Abbe mentioned so much. It was Stephen Weisenfeld's wife died, and he wanted to care for his infant son, but the Social Security laws of the time only gave survivors' benefits to women, not to men, under the stereotypical assumption that women would be caregivers. So she challenged that. She persuaded the Supreme Court to extend the benefits that had previously been available only to women to men as well. But then she did something else. She kept in touch with Stephen Weisenfeld, and she performed his second marriage when he found the love of his life, the second love of his life. And she kept in touch with the son, and she helped him graduate from Columbia Law School, and she performed his marriage. And for Justice Ginsburg, the law was never an abstraction. It was never about abstract principles, although it was about a big abstract principle, which is that the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal, should be extended to embrace previously left out people of color, LGBTQ people, immigrants, all not grudgingly, but with open arms. But in addition to being about soaring principles, it was about the individuals. And she kept in touch with everyone. She was planning to visit with Sharon Frontiero, who was the plaintiff in another of her great cases, this past August, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And not only did she keep in touch with these people, but she remembered each detail of their lives, and she would send them thoughtful cards and ask about their spouses and console with them. And it's really what made her a figure of historic proportions, because she wasn't only the greatest visionary of gender equality as an advocate. She wasn't only the most important Supreme Court justice for gender equality. Diane knew she was also someone who was trying to improve the individual lives of individual men and women who were disadvantaged because of stereotypical assumptions about the way men and women are. She always said generalizations about the way men and women are cannot guide me reliably in making decisions about particular individuals. And in the process of pursuing that soaring, inspiring vision with such particularism and care and loving concern for the individuals affected, she both improved their lives and also transformed American society.
But tactically, and I think you've both written on this. I think, Abbe, you just said the Thurgood Marshall, right? This incrementalist approach of seeing, right, of not going for the big case, but seeing the opportunity within the small step over the course of her career, that building block on building block on building block would be transformative. I kind of want to set the two of you in dialogue with each other to reflect on this, but also on how change is actually made. So someone want to think in terms of tactics of her career legacy? Abbe, do you want to start?
So I think, Rabbi, you're right that she was an incrementalist in the sense that she always said the court is a reactive institution, that the court cannot move too fast. But I do think that in her later years, she grew louder in dissent and saw her moments to either invite Congress to fix things. She was famous for saying things like, in dissent, the ball is in Congress's court. In other words, Congress, you better fix something. But she also had in my view, a very formative period in the late 2000s when she found herself, surprisingly, the only woman on the Supreme Court of the United States. And to my mind, it's there where she was still Justice Ginsburg, but she got louder and louder and louder even before she earned the moniker Notorious RBG. And I'll just give, a couple quick examples of what that was like. But there was a case called Carhart, which was about the federal partial birth abortion bill. And in upholding those restrictions, Justice Kennedy's opinion was very paternalistic and made several comments along the lines of, this law is important because women may come to regret the decisions they make to abort a child. I had this feeling that Justice Ginsburg looked around during this time and said, my goodness, I'm the only woman here and I need to speak louder. And her dissent in that case is incredibly powerful. It takes Justice Kennedy to task in a way that she did not always do so forcefully in majority. She always said dissents were for the future. Dissents were her cause for optimism. Dissents because there's always hope. There's a series of cases like that. Another case in which from the bench about a 13-year-old girl being strip searched for ibuprofen in the gym. And there was a lot of jocularity on the bench among the justices about what locker room play is. And Justice Ginsburg on the bench let her colleagues have it. I think, again, she looked around from left to right and she said, it's just me, right? I need to speak up about the women's experience. And this translated also, and this links back to what Jeff said about the way she was so aware of how the law affects people in daily life. So in a well-known pay discrimination case, she remarked on the fact that the majority of the court was going to allow a woman's pay claim to be expired. The statute of limitations to file will be over because she didn't file it right away. And Justice Ginsburg said, that's not how workplace discrimination works. You don't realize you're being discriminated at first. You're trying to make good with your employer. You're impressing your employer. You give your employer the benefit of the doubt. Over time, soft overtures might not work. Over time, you might realize you have to take firmer action. But that's not the first step for most women in the workplace. That's the last step. And it was efforts like that to sort of bring reality to the law, to communicate the lived experience of women and girls and men in daily life that both made her careful and incrementalist, but also made her revolutionary and made her, for a time, the lone voice of women on the court. I would just say that in her last days of her life on the bench, she was castigating the federal government from her hospital bed for, quote, throwing women's interests to the wind when it came to denying them access to contraception coverage under the Affordable Care Act. That dissent that she wrote was issued just a few months before she died. It's just remarkable that she never stopped speaking up, no matter the cost.
That's so true, Abbe. It's so well expressed, and those examples you gave from the 2000s are so important. Wasn't that amazing listening to her? And you could actually hear the hospital bed going up and down on the oral argument, which we heard by telephone of the Supreme Court. And she said, this is totally unfair. She barely concealed her indignation. I guess I would just want to reflect on a question that I asked her about, which is, how did she transform herself from the judicial minimalist, the judge's judge of the time of her appointment, when she was questioned by some liberals for being too conservative and too incrementalist, to the notorious RBG, the fiery voice of liberal dissent? And I asked her that in 2014, and first she said, oh, Jeff, I didn't change. The court changed. When Justice O'Connor retired in 2006, the court shifted to the right, and I was just standing up for the same principles that I had before. And then she acknowledged that she felt that her role changed in 2010 when Justice Stevens retired and she became the senior associate justice for the majority. That meant that she had the power, when she was in the majority, to assign, to write the decision herself, or to assign it to the justice who best reflected her views. And when she was in dissent, she decided to convince her fellow liberals to speak with one voice. And she felt that a single dissent would carry more power. And that was when she started to write the dissents, such as the Shelby County dissent in the voting rights case that inspired the NYU law student to create the notorious RBG meme. And her memorable phrase, just because you're not getting wet in a rainstorm doesn't mean you throw out your umbrella, was the first of many powerful aphorisms that seized the imagination of the country. But I still ask myself, what the writing seemed so different from the extremely particularistic writing that she used as a lower court judge and in her first years on the bench. Why did it happen? I think it was because of her extraordinary attention to words and her desire to make each word carry force, which Rabbi, of course, was one of the lessons of Yom Kippur, the need not to engage in idle chatter or even idle thoughts, but to think before we speak and to choose each word carefully. She became convinced that once speaking forcefully was more likely to inspire change, that she would do it. And that's why she called on Congress to overturn the Lilly Ledbetter decision, and Congress responded. That's why she issued these clarion calls for change in cases involving affirmative action and partial birth abortion. It was never unmediated or each word told, but she was laying groundwork for future generations to heed the call, which is why she said the dissents were speaking to the future. I believe that we will continue to be inspired by individual phrases and doctrines and words carefully placed in her dissents for decades to come. And it was the greatest blessing for the country that she was able at the end to combine the crusading passion of her advocacy years with the careful doctrinalism that made her so effective as a judge. And those two forces created a kind of apotheosis which converged in making her the great RBG and this historical figure.
You know, I'm seeing, I'm hearing, I'm constructing a picture here, and it's someone who's forceful and unrelenting and unflinching, but also with a great humanity to her. And you know, the image is a Talmudic one that comes to mind of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, who famously disagreed on everything: how you say the Shema, how you light your Chanukiah, how you you know, the whats and the whys of everything. These two greats disagreed, and yet the Talmud is quick to say they ate in each other's homes. Their children married each other. They were able to see, despite their differences. And in the Justice Scalia's memorial service, I came across this comment by Justice Ginsburg, asked how we could be friends, Ginsburg and Scalia, given their disagreement on a lot of things. Justice Scalia answered, "I attack ideas, I don't attack people. Some very good people have some very bad ideas." Now that's the word of Scalia of blessed memory, but I'm just wondering if you could comment on whether it's a relationship itself or between Scalia and Ginsburg, or perhaps about what that reflected about a certain way of engaging in debate that was close to Justice Ginsburg's heart, and in practice, perhaps even so much so that we need it today. We're doing fine in this order, so Abbe, then Jeff.
You know, their friendship was real and profound, and their love for each other was true. And you know, I do think you're right that it's so inspiring and so important in today's environment to see two people who disagreed on so many things about the substantive course of the law and still spent New Year's Eve together. Their spouses were friends. They cared for each other deeply, and they were always able to put their friendship first. I think that, you know, it came from, first, enormous respect for the intellect and integrity of the other. And second, as I said before, this faith that I know Justice Ginsburg had in the Constitution. There's a line from the opera that Jeff already mentioned, written by her daughter-in-law, is something like, "We are different, we are one." And this idea that Justice Ginsburg, and she loved that chorus. And she loved the idea that people could hold different views about individual cases, but both put faith in the country, the Constitution, and the rule of law first. Jeff has so many wonderful stories in the book, so I'm going to let him say them. I won't take them from him, but I'll just give one really beautiful one and then hand it over to him. There's another well-known judge, Jeff Sutton, who commented that one time he was in Justice Scalia's office and he saw 24 roses. And he asked Justice Scalia if the roses were for his wife. And Scalia said, no, they're for Ruth. It's her birthday. I give them to her every year. A conversation proceeds along, and the judge says, how many votes have those roses bought you over the years? And Justice Scalia says, Jeff, some things are more important than votes. And I think that's just, when you talk about choose life, Rabbi, and you talk about optimism for the future and the kind of country we want to have, I've been thinking about that story almost every day for the last week.
So beautiful, Abbe. What a perfect encapsulation of the friendship. And she did indeed love the Scalia-Ginsburg opera. The opera jumped off of an anecdote that she told at Justice Scalia's memorial service that I had a minor role in reporting. When I was, the year after I was a law clerk, I joined the New Republic magazine, and I went to speak to the law clerks of the DC Circuit, and it was just the time when Byron White had retired from the Supreme Court, and the frontrunners for the seat were Lawrence Tribe and Mario Cuomo. So Justice Scalia was talking to the clerks, and someone asked him, if you had to be trapped on a desert island for the rest of your life with Mario Cuomo or Lawrence Tribe, who would it be? And he replied without missing a beat, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she told that story at Justice Scalia's memorial service, adding, within weeks, the president chose me. And the Scalia-Ginsburg opera imagines that both of them are trapped on a desert island for the rest of their lives, and the only way they can escape is by agreeing on a common constitutional methodology. I had a wonderful evening playing Name That Tune when we premiered the opera at the National Constitution Center Board of Trustees meeting, and she comes into the music of Carmen, and Scalia sings a lot of Puccini, but her favorite aria, as Abbe said, was that final one, we are different, we are one, the U.S. contradiction, the tension we adore, separate stands unite in friction. She could recite it from memory. And for her, the shared love for the Constitution and their reverence for the court as an institution was far more important than votes or their disagreements, which she never minimized. She said, you know, I love him, but he drives me crazy. She said, but he makes me laugh harder than anyone else. He just made her crack up. She was extraordinarily, I won't use the word angry because I don't know that she became angry, but I think she was angry about Bush v. Gore, and she was extremely disapproving, and she thought it was a disgrace, to use her word. But she was sitting at the court as she told the story. After the decision came down, Justice Scalia called her and said, Ruth, what are you still doing at the court? Go home and take a warm bath. And she said that was good advice, which she promptly followed. So I do think it is very important on Yom Kippur, Rabbi, as your question suggests, and also at this extraordinarily fraught and perilous time for the country and for the legitimacy of the court as an institution, to remember that friendship, to remember that for both of them, the institutions and most importantly, the ideals were more important than partisan disagreements, that they could disagree without being disagreeable, that they could strongly challenge each other without being disrespectful, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, they would go home and have New Year's together and share laughs and share drinks and be united by their friendship and by their shared devotion to the United States of America.
Thank you. We have time. One last thought, perhaps the two of you could share. I'm sure that lots of our teenagers, lots of the students in the community are watching. Is there something that you would like to share as a final closing word of Jeff, the things you were just saying, of course, but to build on it, that to remember of her legacy, of this great, great woman? Abbe?
So many things that you could say to close out, and I will say something not by way of closure, but maybe by way of opening. Justice Ginsburg would often comment on what she called the genius of the Constitution, that the Constitution, when the nation was founded, could not envision a world in which women were equal and could not envision the evolution of our society to where we are today. I think that, as the rabbi said at her memorial, La Dor Vador, from generation to generation, Justice Ginsburg would want nothing more than the teenagers, boys and girls on this call, to carry that vision forward and always be thinking about how to advance equality, always thinking of those who may not be like them, who may be victims of discrimination, but also always to think about the integrity of our national institutions, the legitimacy of them, to always put them first above partisan rancor or anything else. I think in this time, as you said, Rabbi, in our country, there really can be no other important lesson. And I also was to say she was an optimist. And we need that now, right? We need that optimism. We need people to move forward, choose life, right? And bring us to a better place.
Thank you.
So beautifully said, Abbe. And in that same spirit, I did ask Justice Ginsburg what her advice would be to young boys or girls about how to muster the self-discipline and focus to lead productive and empathetic lives. I wanted the advice from my own boys who are 14 years old, Hugo and Sebastian, and watched the service with me last night, and of course to share with other young girls and boys who could be inspired by her. And this was her answer. If you want your dreams to come true, you must be willing to put in the hard work it takes to make that possible. We live in a society where with will, determination, and dedication, you can be whatever you have the talent to be. And then she added, I would also advise that good citizens have obligations as well as rights. The obligation to help keep our democracy relevant. Young people should pursue something outside themselves, something they're passionate about, ending discrimination or keeping our planet safe, for example. And Rabbi, I must say that those are precisely the sentiments that you were expressing last night in your sermon and that I emphasized to my boys when we were talking. The need to muster the self-discipline and hard work and self-mastery necessary to use whatever talents you have to the best of your ability so that you can have the fulfillment of serving others and making the world better is the definition of happiness, according to Aristotle, who inspired the American framers, who understood happiness not as feeling good, but as being good, as expressing virtue and pursuing our own unique excellence in order to serve others. And that's what this great woman did more spectacularly than any man or woman I've ever had the privilege of knowing. So friends of any age, if you're watching, just let's be inspired by her great example and be our best self. And on a day by day and hour by hour basis, try to overcome those unproductive emotions, buckle down, and use whatever talents we have to serve others. I am so honored by that serendipitous friendship. As a friend noted, it's a good reminder that it's important sometimes not to take the stairs. That elevator ride was, changed my life, but it was all in the service of being inspired by one of the greatest figures for constitutional change in American history and one of the greatest examples of empathy, care, and self-discipline that I'll ever have the privilege of knowing.
Jeffrey Rosen to Abbe Gluck, thank you so much for giving of your wisdom to us, the Park Avenue Synagogue community. We're honored by your presence. We wish you the comfort of memory, our deepest condolences on your personal loss as we reflect on our national loss. May the memory of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg be for a blessing. May her soul be bound up in the bond of life eternal. Amen.